This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, program dedicated to the word, to the thought, and to debate. Brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. If you like us, please consider joining our community of supporters by giving to our Patreon campaign. You'll find it on our homepage. I'm Dahlia Shenlin. Unfortunately, Gilad is not with us today, but every week we continue to talk about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. Our guest today is Professor Ruti Teitel, who is one of the world's renowned experts in international law, international human rights, transitional justice, and comparative constitutional law. She is a professor of comparative law at New York Law School, a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and an affiliated visiting professor at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where she also runs, for 6 years now, a biannual colloquium on transitional justice. And, we hope that our listeners will consider participating at some point. She has an extraordinarily long list of publications and appointments. Ruti Teitel's latest book is Globalizing Transitional Justice, published by Oxford University Press in 2014, which explores the last couple of decades in the evolution of transitional justice. We'll be discussing this and other works, trying to figure out if there is any clear and successful way to move from war, conflict, and oppression to open democratic societies. Professor Ruti Teitel, welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
You're one of the pioneers of this field, and you actually coined the term transitional justice. But I think for our listeners, could you explain for a layperson, educated, intelligent, fabulous laypeople, what transitional justice really is?
Right. So the idea at the time when I was first thinking about it is it's really the bridge between regimes. How do societies move from periods of oppression, wrongdoing, suffering, war, and move into a brighter future? Not always full democracies, but liberalization. And of course, this has been a problem over human history, the Greek city-states. Even in the Bible, we describes the period of wandering in the desert before establishing a state. Post-World War II Germany, an example. Post-apartheid South Africa, those are among the most famous. And then the country where I was born, Argentina. Most of Latin America was plunged in military rule for a long time in the 70s. And in the early 80s, some of the transitions began. And those caught my eye as I was graduating law school.
Right. So I feel like you've explained the transitional part, but tell us where the justice comes into it.
Right. So the justice and not necessarily law, and that is the pursuit of justice and how that is a response to prior regimes, but also focused on the future. So I was very serious about both words, the transitional part, modifying justice. My first book by the same name, Transitional Justice, looked at constitution making, trials, reparations, and saw how different it was in periods of political change, and that actually relativized ideal justice. So that's what it is. It's really a pursuit, it's an aspiration, but there's often pragmatic compromise.
Mm-hmm. And since you mentioned the post-World War II trials, of course, of Nuremberg, I'm curious to know why that was such a major global innovation, in a way, in global justice at the time. But then it's only over the last couple of decades, let's say 20 years roughly, since we've started to identify this as its own field, and since you felt the need to identify this with its own name and a particular field of study. What happened at that time?
Well, at Nuremberg, the normativity existed, and it was a response, actually, to prior transitional justice post-World War I, which was collective and really hit Germany hard and identified the whole country as a, aggressor. And so at the end of World War II, there were jurists. It was a louder pact. Raphael Lemkin, and they slogged it out to try to identify both genocide, that was Lemkin's term, and Lauterpacht, crimes against humanity. But your question really goes to why did this really, get beyond the norms and beyond that big trial? And that's the answer to that is the Cold War. Right after Nuremberg, what happens is our friends become our enemies, the Soviets that were part of Nuremberg, you get the Cold War, and so you basically don't have that kind of global cooperation to establish an international criminal court, which was contemplated by the Genocide Convention. It's just all paralyzed. It's static for decades. So then basically the term and really the production of transition happens at the end of the Cold War. And you see that from Africa to Latin America. And now we have more unfoldings, obviously, in the Middle East and so on. So it would take the end of the Cold War. Yeah.
Right. And I'm curious about your particular interest in it because you did mention at the start that you were born in Argentina. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious to know what about your experiences there led you to take such an interest in this topic?
So I would say it was overdetermined. My grandfather came from Hamburg. He fought in World War I. He got the Iron Cross for the Kaiser, and then everything changes after the Nuremberg 1933. He was able to take his family to Argentina. Of course, later many Nazis went there too, but there was a real influx of refugees. And so, obviously I had an interest in World War II because of that family experience. But then they settled in Argentina, and it was really the end of the Cold War and the changes at the end of military rule in Argentina. It was really the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, the role of non-governmental actors, even under military rule, that captured my attention, the role of women who had lost their children, who had been detained and were now, this new term disappeared. At the time, I was working with the Anti-Defamation League, and we wrote an amicus under my authorship, really, for those who were detained, who happened to be Jewish and were treated actually worse. There was a lot of anti-Semitism at that time under military rule in Argentina. So that was the beginning of it. But then I realized this is not just one example, not just one country. And I was asked to write a memo for the Council on Foreign Relations, even back then, because of the changes that had been happening in Uruguay, Chile, and Argentina. The question posed at the time was, do those countries have to have trials in order to become full-fledged democracies? And I was singled out by one of the people who ran the workshop there on Latin America to write this because I knew Spanish and seemed to have more knowledge about Argentina in particular. Right. So that's what started my journey in this topic.
So you've really accompanied this field from its infancy in the modern era, and I'm really curious to find out, what were some of the early dilemmas faced by democratizing countries? For example, I will start with one of the ones that you point out in the early phase, which is the dilemma between amnesty and punishment. Can you talk a little bit about that, or any other dilemma that you think characterized that early phase?
Yes, exactly. That was the subject of that first memo, was punishment versus impunity. That was a term nobody had heard before, and then all of a sudden it was coming out about Latin America, because what was happening is that even though Argentina started with trials, they would end up having to stop. It was called the full stop law, and then later pardons by Menem, because of the vulnerability of democracy and the threats posed by the military, still the military at that time. So I was very interested in that dilemma, and actually that was the subject of the memorandum for the council. I had a 10-page limit, which was really difficult, and what I wrote there was that actually it doesn't require a full trial, and in fact most countries in transition can't really provide a full press trial, and that actually there were other ways to convey rule of law, and I actually talked about truth investigations and other ways at the time. So that was one of the very first dilemmas.
Yeah, I mean, I found it interesting that you point out that certain countries, including Uruguay, which had a referendum, in which people preferred amnesty to the trial. Can you explain what that means? I mean, why would people prefer that to seeing the bad guys punished?
Well, that's a question for maybe political psychologists and, maybe the kind of work you do on campaigns. I would say that part of the issue there was how systemic these policies were, and why did the military come to, control most of Latin America in the first place? The elite considered this kind of law and order message better than, many thought that guerrilla and, Marxist groups were destroying the market and so forth. And so it was a variety of different themes that led to the military being in control in the first place. And so in the end, the question was, how will we move forward? And the same kind of dilemma was presented in South Africa. And there you have a country, and it's even, you might say stranger, that a majority was repressed by a minority. And that wasn't the case in Argentina. It was a minority still that were the political opposition. A majority decided to move in the direction of reconciliation, again, because of the concern about what backward-looking justice would look like. So that's actually really, to my mind, still remains the most remarkable deliberation and decision of a people.
Because ultimately, this concept of transitional justice looks in two directions.
Yes,
it looks
does.
backwards and it looks forward.
Absolutely. And I think it's very important to remember that South Africa was not just about truth and reconciliation, which is something that, NGOs here have picked up, and it's kind of a very appealing concept. That went hand in hand, and that decision about amnesty was part of a constitutional project. So it was a commitment by the country in a forward-looking political direction. And, even, people who themselves had been victims of bombs like Justice Albie Sachs and so on were very much in favor favor of reconciliation.
Another wonderful Tel Aviv Review interviewee.
Oh, well, he and I have spoken together in England, and he introduced me with a song he sang in the prison cell, which was very moving. Yeah, that kept him animated. Yeah.
Well, since you raised the idea is that it was part of a constitution in terms of building the next phase of the country's life. I think that I want to open up this enormous topic of transitional justice and politics because, there's all this sort of tension. Is it political? Is it politicized? Should it be devoid of politics? And I was struck when you analyzed Nuremberg at one point and you wrote that one of the particular judgments you were writing that it was neither political nor moral but legal, referring to the judgment on the use of force and that the war itself was a crime. But how can you take away politics and morality from law? I mean, what is law devoid of politics and morality, especially if the raison d'etre of transitional justice is to help build a new political system?
Well, I'm certainly not a fan of separating these two. And in fact, if anything, again, the modification or relativization of justice by the word transitional, to my mind, was always to remember the political context. And I think that's extremely important. And, even if you think about Nuremberg, it was important to some of the Allies to have a trial. But, and for them, they considered it a matter of moral education. Just a number of years after that, most of the leaders were subject to some of them, obviously, they were killed. Some of them were executed. But you end the trials project because of politics at that time, because of the alliance with the Soviets. And I would say that in terms of themes, that are relevant here and also in Latin America, in the Middle East today, Tunisia, politics is very much at the core of these decisions. No one is advocating, at least not to my knowledge, a pursuit of law outside of the political context.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there are so many layers of what politics means. I mean, on the one hand, I think you've made it clear that transitional justice emerged to help build a new political kind of community, but it's also morphing into something that was intended to help build democracies to a particular kind of democracy. Liberal democracies, multicultural tolerance. Can you talk about that shift? Or do you not see it as a shift, but just one element?
Well, I think that the determination is if it's a political determination, will always depend on the nature of the community at that time. Who is the we? And, in South Africa, now it's 20 years, a certain determination was made, but now they're revisiting. And the same thing in the Balkans. We are now celebrating, marking, doing stock taking of 25 years, 1/4 century since the ICTY. And these were decisions made in the middle of conflict, right? The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And, now it's a question of delegating power back to the local, and they're going to have to, they're pursuing other means. So I would say that these are determinations that are being made by different political communities at different times. And you don't see transition overnight. And I think that's very important. Even in the United States, coming out of the revolution with England, you have different stages. You have a colonial stage, you have Articles of Confederation, and it's not till, later on that people are willing to centralize power in a judiciary and a president. So you see that kind of phases of transition in other countries as well.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, the International Criminal Tribunal on Yugoslavia is a fascinating example.
Yeah.
And as our listeners might know, I could talk about it for a long time. So I'd like to ask you, let's start with the question that I think is most relevant there. How effective was it to start the tribunal during the wars?
I think there was no choice about that. I think it was extremely important for the forward-looking aspect of the tribunal's work, which was deterrence. So it was really a decision made by the Security Council in the midst of the conflict. And, you could say that a very unusual tribunal. In a way, it was the first international regional tribunal because they were taking up crimes of a region in the middle of conflict. And I think any assessment or evaluation of the successes of the tribunal has to keep that in mind, the fact that it was a wartime context. So I think the fact that it was during conflict was extremely important for the deterrence aspect of it. But of course, it would also be constraining. They couldn't prosecute leaders until much later because they were on the run. And so you start with a lower level. Actually, I was doing some war crimes observation, and I was a commentator on Court TV during that time. And, it was strange to the viewers to start with someone unknown like Duško Tadić. But that's also part of justice, is there is an element of contingency.
Right. And do you think it had a deterrent effect, or do you think that wartime tribunals actually protect, because there is, protection is part of the goal? do we have any way to assess where they actually protect?
Those are complicated questions. Obviously,
that's why we're here.
Yeah. Obviously, we think that courts and law and security have a deterrent effect because we have them in ordinary times, right? When obviously law is under enforced. Not every crime gets fully prosecuted and so on. But we do believe that having criminal law and having police, deters crime. There are several scholars who are pursuing that research, and they do conclude that, it had a deterrent effect. At the same time, we have to concede that there were massacres that occurred despite the fact that the tribunal had been established. But I think all of that question of evaluation, first of all, it's a counterfactual. We don't know how things would have proceeded, how much more violent the conflict would have been without the tribunal. These are very difficult assessments of both fact and law. And the timing also depends. And many people see, not an effect immediately, but effect, after 15 years, that sort of thing.
Right.
So there's a book, Courting Democracy, that focuses on that. And then a recent book that's come out about the ICTY as well.
And I guess it also goes back to those questions we started to open up about the politicization. It's a different kind of politicization because I think one of the main critiques of the ICTY from people in the region and any observer is that every single judgment of guilt was considered an anti-judgment against whatever that country was, and every acquittal was considered politically against whichever country was victimized by that person. So how do we deal with that kind of perception of
very
justice?
Troubling. And I know I've gone to the region many times, and I actually was dismayed by that kind of comment, from all sides and at relatively high levels of sophistication. And that struck me, the absence of responsibility taking. I suppose that that will await more maturation and more distance from the conflict. You see that as well. At the end of World War II, there are surveys in Germany, and they're all against the trials. And then, you have the trials starting domestically in Germany and, 50s, late 50s, early 60s. And then now Germany is one of the biggest supporters of the ICC, of the International Criminal Court, and they continue to have their own prosecutions even after decades. So I think that question, where I sit, I've seen a lot of change occurring as countries mature, as the democracy becomes consolidated, and there's new generations that don't necessarily identify with the war criminals.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very interesting point. I was thinking about this because, as we discussed before, I just came back from Kosovo over the weekend where, the war is still very present in people's minds, and somebody was telling me terrible stories about Serb atrocities against his family, but then he quickly moved into telling about terrible things that the Albanian Kosovars did, these are his own people, to Serbs and to each other. And this was told with a great sense of bitterness. And I don't get the sense that there was any way for someone like that to have a sense that as a collective, people are taking responsibility for this. Now they have the special court. But I guess my question is, can you characterize different approaches for transitional justice when it's our side blaming their side, which needs to happen, but also when it's within our own community? Is there a different way of looking at it, or are there different characteristics of that kind of within the legal approach that take into account those sensitivities and the difficulty of countries confronting their own people?
Well, that question of who's their own people, of course, is kind of the bottom line. Part of what we're trying to see or formulate is what kind of mechanisms allow warring sides to then move into citizenship and seeing themselves as parts of citizens, equal citizens with dignity in the same state. So, it's kind of the tail wagging the dog. I think that it's a nice anecdote that you gave because in the beginning, he's only focusing on other crimes and then turns more to their own or internal. So I think that that's part of the vocabulary that has, ends up changing through legal language, right? And so the idea, and certainly the ICTY, the idea, and this was presented by the prosecutors at the time, was to limit group vengeance by emphasizing individual accountability, and that would allow people to disconnect from the group and that kind of group mentality, and then being able to then see themselves as get beyond perpetrators, get beyond victims, to become citizens, to really see themselves as equal citizens.
Yeah, I mean, this raises another dilemma that there are just so many interesting questions here. But, what's the difference and the considerations between prosecuting an individual versus a system? I think this kind of characterizes the entire history of the field.
Sure. Well, obviously, as you can imagine, you can't prosecute a system, but there has to be a scholarship and study of the system. Even a country like South Africa, where it was apartheid, really the policy, not enough was highlighted about the policy policy in the Truth Commission. And, now scholars looking back think that there should have been more emphasis on policy. That, to my mind, is the most important issue, systematicity. And, yes, individuals, but also how are decisions made in bureaucracies in a way that allows these policies to be enforced and applied and really in a persecutory fashion. So that's, I think, to my mind, the most important thing about the ICTY was its emphasis on the crime of ethnic cleansing. And that was really what that tribunal is known for.
I'm thinking about two cases where transitional justice either didn't happen or took a particularly extreme violent form. And I'm curious about what are the politics behind the case where it can't happen, which is due to politicization. And that's Turkey and Armenia, right? They cannot address their past because of all the international politics surrounding this. And do you think that holds them back?
Who's the they?
Well,
Turkey and
either
Armenia?
Side, I guess.
Yeah.
I think either side, because I think there's a case to be made that both sides are being held back by it. Maybe not Turkey, although one could claim that a big part of their opposition, who are often oppressed, are people who want to address that past.
Yeah.
And Armenia, so much of their national identity and efforts are focused on genocide recognition. Some would say at the expense of other things.
Well, Armenia now has had a successful political change.
Yes, and that's something actually remarkable.
That's something to appreciate. But I would say the following, and that is that, obviously when there are massacres, genocide that's occurred centuries ago, part of what we're left with is how to think about this historically. And that has been very important for Armenians. And countries, once they're, they see themselves as more established, as, having consolidated democracy, they're able to take into account more than one narrative, a narrative of a minority and the importance of identifying and recognizing what happened to them. Turkey is not in that state now. It is not a democracy. It is a place that, that is repressing its own journalists. So it's, to my mind, this goes hand in hand with the current leadership. I wouldn't expect much different. And I think it is a sign, it's a symptom of a place that is, completely illiberal at this point.
Yeah, although it's not a new development that they're not able to deal with the past. Yeah.
No.
And I guess the other example that I try to think of exactly what the question is, but I think that if we're looking at your entire corpus of work as essentially in a way advocating transitional justice because you're helping to develop the field, I thought about Romania, and, they have had truth commissions and attempts to open up the past since 1989. But what happened there was simply a monkey court, a kangaroo, or kangaroo court, whichever animal you want to use, where the dictators were executed after 90 minutes. So what?
Yeah, I don't favor. Well,
I figured you don't favor that, but I'm curious as to how you would explain why you would favor a different kind of process than that. And if you can point to the potential impact that might have had.
So it's what happened to Ceausescu, and you saw that with Mussolini at the end of the war, and you can contrast, the hanging of Mussolini from a tree with the Nuremberg trials. And, even at the time of Nuremberg, the Allies were split about this. There were some that thought that you should just continue the war, just shoot them. And that's the alternative. So we always have to remember the alternative to the trials. And no one would advocate a phony trial or a speedy trial which lacks due process as constituting transitional justice. And I think this is a great mistake in the literature if there are people who are advocating that kind of speedy trial as a form of transitional justice.
Are there people advocating that?
No, I'm saying if they are, then that would not be, to my mind, that would not be just. And that's why the use of a vocabulary that really is more aspirational than just whatever the law is in a particular country. But I think the main point is that if these trials are to have a message of rule of law, that totally backfires, having that kind of, basically just some statements prior to an execution. I mean, that would not be a trial. And I really think that the ICTY in this way, it was to be commended. The fact that there were acquittals, there was defense counsel. If there wasn't, if the facts were not there, it's quite difficult, as you know, the evidentiary standard for a criminal trial. So, it puts a lot of pressure on systems in times of political change. And that's part of the reason that sometimes people move away from the use of criminal process to other forms. But I definitely think that those were, in Romania, it was, a sense of, I suppose, an emotional response to the end of communism. And you saw that in a number of other countries. You saw that in France, after all, at the end of World War II, where collaborators were picked out and so on. I mean, this happens. It's a kind of human history.
Yeah,
right?
And at the risk of trying to be too sort of cause and effect result focused, I mean, it would be so interesting if there was a way to quantify or measure what the impact in former Yugoslavian republics is of having had that process versus a country like Romania, who has been, struggling for the last few decades to develop their own democratic culture with only partial success. And there's, lots of critique in former Yugoslavia, too, about quasi-semi-democratic systems often rife with corruption. And so I just wonder if we can point to some sort of causal link.
Well, I would think the causal link that I see is that the countries that had a history of democracy, like you take a country like Chile or Czechoslovakia, they tend to do better in political transition. The shorter the period of repression, the longer the traditions of, prior traditions of liberalism. Doesn't necessarily need to be, Western democracy, but some kind of recognition of pluralism. Well, then you're going to have a better shot later. Not surprising if you think about it.
No, but that's a very logical point, which brings me to my last set of questions. You couldn't escape this, which is what about Israel and the Palestinians? I mean, we have all the complexities in one. So you were saying countries with a long liberal tradition probably do better after the transition at getting back to it. Israel has a side-by-side liberal democratic tradition and an extremely oppressive regime going on at the same time. Can you think of a particular kind of transitional justice mechanism that you think would be appropriate for here?
Well, I've been coming for a while and raising some of these issues. Part of my approach here, even though I'm a scholar of these issues from the very beginning, is to hear from people here. And, I'm teaching while I'm here. That's the whole point, is the colloquium is about sharing knowledge on these issues with students, faculty, and practitioners. And it's open to the public at Hebrew U at the law school. So this is part of what we're trying to do, is have a space for dialogue about these issues. And our donor, Julie Gall, is a documentary filmmaker and a philanthropist. So it's the Fried Gall Colloquium. So it's something different than the traditional courses where the students, know exactly the category of law and so on. The idea here is to have lunchtime talks about these issues, which is one way of addressing your question, which is, I have been exposed to some of the scholarship and international law. I think most of the activist scholars here are emphasizing the international humanitarian law aspect of in the region. What does that do? Well, what that does is at least be preservative and as protective as possible if the law is followed, folks on either side of the Green Line. So the idea there is that humanitarian law, at least its main value, is preservative. And where that's not happening, that's to be critiqued, okay? That's to be challenged. So that's more about protecting rights on both sides for now. And I think that scholarship and activism is going on, maybe not as well as it could be. I think that that's part of what groups like Adala are trying to do, to have as much equality as possible for Arab Israelis and others in the occupied territories. I think it's a completely different question of how they're going to move forward. What that is stasis, but protective. And that's a subject of another book I wrote and several articles on what I call humanities law, which is, the law that relates to persons and peoples in international affairs. On the other hand, there are those who are trying to do something that, when you talked about politics earlier, I think that a solution depends on politics here, if that's what you're asking, what can be done. So, yes, protect rights as much as possible and have the kind of legal regime that allows people to relate and to be able to have those political deliberations as equals, okay, that's very important. And so at least that. What will happen after that? The possibility of politics, like most people over a certain age, I remember the Oslo Accords. I remember moments of more hopefulness. And I think that one of the things we see with transition is we never know exactly when it's going to happen. People did not predict 89, even Sovietologists, people who knew all they didn't predict it. People did not predict 2011 and the Arab Spring. So, what is possible? I want to still remain hopeful about this region, especially in light of changes that have happened with neighboring countries. But, I know that there are activist groups that focus, for example, on history, like Zochrot and so on. Yeah. I'm not necessarily sure that that's going to bring us any closer. I think that often, and you know that from the Balkans, historical narratives can be so acrimonious and so backward-looking that it doesn't really allow for the future political project to move in any direction. So I'm concerned about that. I think the preservative part is important, preserving as much history and making people aware. But beyond that, I don't know that I think the answer is going to be more pragmatic and that there will have to be compromises on some of those issues.
Right. And it's interesting also that you mentioned the countries of the region, because I think in the introduction to your most recent book from 2014, you talk about how transitional justice became, in a way, a goal in itself of the Arab revolutions. And that brings me to another question, which also based on an article that you have called From Dictatorship to Democracy, which, by the way, shares a name with the book by Gene Sharp, From Dictatorship to Democracy, about nonviolent action to end dictatorships and reach democracy. So the reason I mention it is because you're indicating that transitional justice mentality, even if they're not using the same term, is an end in itself and can maybe help motivate people. So is there an activist part of transitional justice that's also about making the transition happen, not just coping with the transition?
Sure. And I think that the call for change, for example, in some of the countries in the Middle East, Tunisia and others, was actually a legal claim. They were demanding, an end to corruption, and in a very particular case involving a vendor, equal treatment, due process. So we're beyond just the simple democracy wish. And in fact, in many of those countries, the most that's going to happen is consultative rule, because it's a different kind of, there are theocracies, there are monarchies, like in Jordan. So basically, people are demanding some kind of process, some kind of legal regime to happen and change from, corruption to something freer and fairer. So yes, I think the language of law has really informed democracies today. We're not just constitutional democracies, but people are seeking rule of law and something as fair and simple as that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's an optimistic note to end on, because with all the failures of international law and with all the ongoing conflict in the world, maybe just the fact that the public around the world has a consciousness that they deserve equal treatment under the law is a victory in itself.
I agree. I think that would be a good place to focus our energies. So,
well, we hope that the world will continue to go as we see it, because we've come to a very nice optimistic ending.
We're seeing that in Korea, actually. Yeah. I've already co-edited a book on transitional justice in unified Korea. That was 3-4 years ago. We didn't know just how quickly it would happen. So that, I think that gets to that point. The timing is often unknown, but one has to be ready.
Right. Well, that's a great note to end on. That's Professor Ruti Teitel speaking about her very large corpus of work on transitional justice, most recently her book, Globalizing Transitional Justice, and many other articles. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you, Dahlia. Thank you very much.
Thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Julia Brahms and Itai Shelem, our producers. And a big thank you to the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute for their generous support. Now, a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app. And we'd like to ask you to please consider writing a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and press write a review. Then write one. Check out our archives. We have over 450 interviews. If you like us, you can like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel, and follow both Gilad and me on Twitter. Join us next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.